Hello everyone, welcome to Eye on Africa. Here are the headlines for Monday, May the 3rd. As journalists and organizations around the globe mark World Press Freedom Day, we'll take a look at the state of the freedom of the press in Africa and how the coronavirus pandemic has impacted it. French prosecutors recommend complicity charges are dropped against French soldiers who were stationed in Rwanda at the time of the 1994 genocide. NGOs who represent survivors of the massacres call the request a denial of justice. And we'll take you to South Africa, where the parliament is debating a bill on land expropriation. Supporters see it as a way to try to fix the damage and the division left behind by apartheid. Thank you for joining us here on France 24. As we just mentioned, today is World Press Freedom Day. In just a moment, we'll be speaking to Muthoki Mumo. She is the Sub-Saharan Africa representative for the Committee to Protect Journalists. We'll ask her about the state of press freedom in Africa and how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the way journalists do their job over the past year. But first, let's take a look at some of the stories making headlines in this developing story out of Burkina Faso. Local media and security sources there say several dozens of people have been killed in an attack on a village in the country's east. According to those sources, a large number of men, believed to belong to jihadist groups, attacked the village of Kadiel near the border with Niger early Monday morning. They shot and killed several residents before forcing the remaining residents to flee by setting their homes on fire. We'll have more on this story in our next edition of Eye on Africa in just under an hour. Prosecutors in France have recommended that judges drop a case accusing former French soldiers deployed in Rwanda of complicity in crimes against humanity. Survivors of the 1994 genocide had accused French troops of deliberately abandoning them to Hutu extremists. Prosecutors in Paris concluded that a 15-year-old investigation did not make it possible to establish the soldiers could have been guilty of complicity in genocide. Survie, an NGO which advocates better relations between France and Africa, called the decision a denial of justice.
This is a denial of justice. The Duclerc report and those involved at the time, in particular the head of the army, say that all the decisions were under his control, and therefore it's ridiculous that the judges claim that the military on the ground were autonomous. The Duclerc report gives few new elements, but it does give some that are incriminating in this Bicicero affair. It gives two in particular. It notes this close link between the Parisian decision makers and what is happening on the ground. This is the effective negation of Duclerc's work by the judges.
South Africa has received its first doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. A little over 325,000 doses arrived at Johannesburg's International Airport this Monday. Some of the doses will be tested for quality control before they are then sent out across the country. South Africa expects nearly 4.5 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine by the end of June and some 30 million by the end of the year. Authorities are planning on using both the Pfizer and the Johnson & Johnson shot to vaccinate 2/3 of South Africans by February of next year. The Democratic Republic of Congo has declared the end of an Ebola outbreak that killed 6 people in the province of North Kivu. A flare-up emerged in February in the city of Butembo when a woman died after her husband contracted the virus in a previous outbreak. Authorities were able to contain the outbreak by administering an Ebola vaccine to more than 1,600 patients, all of them contacts or contacts of people who were diagnosed with the disease. Now, as we mentioned just a few minutes ago, this Monday is World Press Freedom Day, a day for journalists to reflect about issues of press freedom and ethics, as well as a reminder to governments of the need to respect their commitment to freedom of the press. Let's bring in Muthoki Mumo. She is the Sub-Saharan Africa representative for the Committee to Protect Journalists. She joins us now from Nairobi. Thank you very much for being with us. It's been a challenging year once again for journalists covering the news in Africa. How would you evaluate the state of press freedom in Africa today?
Well, thank you so much for having me today. As you noted, today is the day when we reflect on and look at the year that has been for journalists. And we're celebrating acts of brave journalism. I think we must recognize that we're celebrating journalists who are doing their jobs in incredibly difficult situations. But the reality is, in Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly over the past 1 year, we've been seeing a decline, a regression of press freedom conditions in various countries for many reasons. Now, numbers don't always give us the full picture, but we look at numbers to indicate how things are going. And if you look at 2020 in particular, we as a Committee to Protect Journalists documented a record high number of journalists detained around the world, the highest number since we started keeping records in 1992. In sub-Saharan Africa, we saw that number also rising to 45 journalists throughout the region, up from 38. Similarly, if you look at the data for killed journalists, still depressing. We're seeing journalists being killed in places like Somalia or Nigeria. So the numbers don't tell the whole story, but they give us an idea of how bad things were for journalists. And these are the top line figures. They do not include daily harassment of journalists on the job, whether it's them being assaulted by security personnel while covering politics in places like Uganda, while covering protests in places like Somalia, being forced to delete footage, being threatened on an everyday basis, having to censor themselves. So what we're seeing is a decline in many parts of the region. Additionally, a lot of expression has gone online. We're seeing people increasingly using social media platforms to tell their stories and to report the news. And similarly, we've seen the repression migrating online. We are seeing an acceleration of the aggression of the online space and freedom of speech in the online space, whether this is through blunt tools of censorship, such as internet shutdowns, as we've seen in Ethiopia or in Uganda, or whether this is through more targeted means, such as blocking specific websites, or mobilizing trolls to harass journalists. So these are just some of the trends we're seeing.
Very quickly, because we don't have much time left, unfortunately, how do you think the coronavirus pandemic has affected journalists' ability to do their job in Africa?
It has made a bad situation even worse. Journalists have been arrested for reporting COVID-19 in manners that didn't match state narratives. Journalists have had problems accessing information. And this is not while considering the risks that they face going out in their communities every day, sometimes without protective equipment, to tell the news. So really, it has made a bad situation even worse. And we as CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, have been concerned that we'll see this pandemic having long-term effects on journalism that we can't fully assess right now. And this is particularly so when you look at the legislative environment, where we've seen a hardening of laws criminalizing speech, under the justification that we need to control information about the pandemic, or even the enactment of new laws to control what can be said during this time. And these will definitely have long-term impacts.
Muthoki Mumo, of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Again, I'm sorry we don't have much more time, but we really appreciate you coming over and talking to us about this story. The South African Parliament is debating an amendment to the Constitution to allow for land expropriation without compensation. Those in favor see it as a way to redress the economic legacy of colonialism and apartheid. Around 90% of privately owned farmland in South Africa is owned by white people. Our team on the ground went to the Demersfontein wine estate near Cape Town to take a look at a model being touted as an alternative vehicle of black empowerment. Sam Bradpiece, Stefan Karstens, and Caroline Dumais have this report.
Over the past few years, farm workers have acquired a 44% stake in the Demersfontein wine label.
This has been a very interesting season, much longer harvest than we've known in probably 25 years.
18 years ago, the director set up Thokozani, a black empowerment company majority owned by the workers, who now use it as a vehicle to buy shares.
If you share resources with your staff team, if you encourage people to contribute both skills, time and commitment, then this makes an awful lot of sense. That's how you build bigger businesses.
Through Thokozani, shareholders have held on to full salary jobs during the COVID period. This employee owns close to 1,000 euros worth of shares in the label. He receives dividends and is proud of his ownership.
It is an incentive for me to work harder, because at the end of the day I will pick the fruits of it, because it's my business and I must look after my business.
While the National Parliament debates land redistribution without compensation as a means of black empowerment and a way to address some of South Africa's historic inequalities, the director of Thokozani says the model implemented here on the estate is an adequate alternative.
Absolutely, I believe that this must be implemented in other farms, and I also believe that our government needs to come down on the root level and not just on policy levels.
The Thokozani model has been praised as an innovative approach to black empowerment in South Africa.
Finally, to Gabon and the plight of professional footballers there who rarely get their salaries paid. Clubs have very little money, and just like across much of the planet, the coronavirus pandemic has halted competitions and made a bad situation even worse. Nicolas Germain has the story.
Chiko Sassou is a professional footballer in Gabon. Like most of his colleagues, he finds it hard to make ends meet. According to trade unions, footballers only get paid on average 2 months a year. Clubs lack funds, state subsidies are not paid on time, and the coronavirus has made the situation even worse.
Ça fait 13 mois que nous sommes sans compétition, nous sommes à l'arrêt. Quand on vient jouer le samedi ou le dimanche, c'est pas le même niveau, c'est pas la même intensité, donc c'est vraiment difficile. Donc il faut bien qu'on entretienne le corps parce que un joueur pense toujours à demain.
Some professional footballers have had to change jobs. Gamamba Suleiman has become a painter.
J'ai des charges, j'ai mes projets, et je me rends compte que le football ne peut rien m'apporter. Au Gabon, qu'est-ce que je fais? Je ne vais pas rêver. Mes rêves, c'est pour autre chose, plus pour le football. Voilà, donc là, je suis passé à autre chose. Pour le moment, si seulement j'ai une autre possibilité de partir de ce pays et aller jouer ailleurs, moi j'irai. Hein.
Gamamba Suleiman says he earns much more money since he has become a painter. The situation was already difficult before the coronavirus, and the pandemic, by cancelling all competitions, has forced many footballers in Gabon to abandon the career of their dreams.
That wraps up Eye on Africa. More news coming up here on France 24 in just a moment.